The moment Birdie Dugan raised her hand in that sweltering, smoke-choked meeting hall, every jaw in Caldwell Creek went slack with the audacity of it. The summer of 1882 had turned the Texas Panhandle into a cracked, golden wasteland, and the people of Caldwell Creek were desperate enough to argue over every last inch of it. The town sat at the edge of a broad, wind-scoured plain where the grass grew short and brittle, and the sky overhead was the particular shade of blue that only exists west of the 100th meridian, a blue so pure and so empty it made a person feel very small indeed. There were perhaps 300 souls in Caldwell Creek, and on that Thursday afternoon in late July, it seemed as though every last one of them had crammed themselves into the Elks Hall on Main Street to argue about water rights and land boundaries, until the heat and the fury combined into something that smelled like trouble. Birdie Dugan was 26 years old, and she had been widowed for 14 months. Her husband, Thomas Dugan, had died of a fever in the spring of the previous year, leaving her with 40 acres of hardscrabble farmland on the western edge of town, a half-finished irrigation ditch, and a reputation for being far too opinionated for a woman in her circumstances. She wore her dark brown hair pinned up under a straw bonnet that had seen better decades, and her dress was a faded calico the color of dried cornflowers, patched at the elbows and let out twice at the waist for the kind of manual labor she'd been doing since Thomas died. She was not the sort of woman men looked at when she walked into a room and immediately thought of romance. She was the sort of woman they looked at and immediately thought would argue them into the ground. Which was precisely why she had come to the meeting. Harrison Galt had been buying up land in Caldwell Creek for 3 years running. He was not from Texas, which the people of Caldwell Creek would have forgiven if he had not also been the kind of man who smiled too broadly, shook hands too firmly, and looked directly over your shoulder when he spoke to you, as though he were already searching for someone more important. He owned the newly chartered Galt Land and Cattle Company, and through a combination of shrewd legal maneuvering, predatory loan calling, and outright intimidation, he had acquired nearly a third of the farmable land in the county. Now he wanted the Sweetwater Creek tributary that fed the southwestern quarter of the valley, including the 40 acres that Birdie Dugan had inherited from Thomas. The meeting had been going for an hour and 20 minutes when Birdie raised her hand. In that time, Harrison Galt's lawyer, a slick man from Dallas named Reeves Portman, had presented a series of legal documents suggesting that the original land surveys conducted in 1874 had placed the tributary boundary in an entirely different location than where everyone in town believed it to be. 3 of the larger ranchers had spoken. 2 of them, men who owed Galt money, had sided with him. The third, old Amos Pickering, had begun to say something sensible before Portman talked over him, with a reference to a Texas property statute that nobody in the room could immediately refute. Several of the smaller farmers and their wives sat in rows of wooden chairs near the back, their faces tight with worry, their hands folded in their laps with the particular stillness of people who have learned that speaking their mind rarely improves their situation. Birdie had counted 9 men speak before she raised her hand. Not one of them had mentioned the original homestead filings, which she had spent 3 weeks reading in the county clerk's office. Not one of them had mentioned the letter from the Texas General Land Office, dated April of 1876. Not one of them had mentioned the fact that Portman's survey documents cited a reference point, a marked cottonwood tree at the junction of 2 cattle paths that had burned down in a grass fire in 1879 and no longer existed to be measured from. She raised her hand, and the room did not go quiet. Several men were still talking, still gesturing at Portman's maps, still working themselves up into the red-faced frustration that passes for debate in a Texas meeting hall in July. It was Clement Whitfield who saw her. He was standing at the back of the room near the door, which was propped open to let in what passed for a breeze, his hat in his hands and his dark eyes moving steadily around the space, with the alert patience of a man accustomed to watching for things before they happened. Clement Whitfield was 31 years old and had been the foreman of the Rocking W Ranch for 6 years, a position he had earned through a combination of genuine skill with cattle and horses, and an absolute refusal to panic in situations that called for panic. He was tall in the way that some men are tall without thinking about it, and his face was weathered brown by years of outdoor work, with deep lines at the corners of his eyes that came from squinting into sun and wind rather than from age. His hands, wrapped around the brim of his hat, were large and capable, and bore the particular scars and calluses of someone who had been working hard since before he was old enough to choose otherwise. He had come to the meeting because the Rocking W's eastern pasture bordered the tributary in question, and because his employer, Jacob Whitmore, was bedridden with a bad hip and had asked Clement to attend in his place. He had listened to the whole proceeding with growing frustration, because he could tell, plain as daylight, that Portman was running a confidence game on the room, and the room was falling for it because Portman's suit was expensive, and his accent was educated, and his papers had official-looking stamps on them. And then he saw the woman in the faded blue dress with her hand raised. She was not a large woman, but something about the way she held herself, the straightness of her spine, the directness of her gaze, the absolute steadiness of her raised arm, made her visible in a way that had nothing to do with size. She had been raised by a schoolteacher father and a mother who believed that women were entitled to opinions as long as they could defend them, and she had spent 26 years developing both opinions and the ability to defend them, and right now she was defending them with nothing but a raised arm in a room full of men who were not looking at her. Clement Whitfield looked at her. He looked at her for a moment that stretched longer than it should have, and then he did something that surprised even himself. He put 2 fingers to his lips and let out a sharp, carrying whistle that cut through the noise of the room like a blade through rope. The room went quiet. Into that quiet, Clement's voice, low and certain and carrying the natural authority of a man who was used to being heard above wind and cattle and the general chaos of outdoor work, said, "Everyone listened to her." Several heads turned toward him with expressions of varying degrees of irritation. Several more turned toward Birdie, whose hand was still raised, whose cheeks had gone slightly pink, not with embarrassment but with the particular flush that comes when you have steeled yourself for a fight and someone unexpectedly hands you the floor. Reeves Portman cleared his throat and began, "Now, I don't see why we need to hear from." "She raised her hand," Clement said, and his voice had not gotten louder, but it had gotten quieter in the way that is more commanding than loud, "and she's been holding it up longer than some of you have been talking." The room was quiet enough now that the sound of a horse on the street outside was audible. Birdie lowered her hand, smoothed the front of her dress, and began to speak. Her voice was clear and unhurried, and she spoke in complete sentences, which was already distinguishing her from most of the previous speakers. She said that she had spent the last 3 weeks at the county clerk's office, reviewing the original homestead filings from 1871 through 1879, and that the reference points cited in Portman's survey documents, specifically the marked cottonwood at the junction of the Carver and Milligan cattle paths, had been a known landmark at the time of the 1874 survey, but had been destroyed in the grass fire of September 1879. A fire which was itself documented in the town meeting minutes of October 1879, which she had also read. She said that any survey measurement taken from a reference point that no longer physically existed was, at minimum, unverifiable, and that Mr. Portman would need to provide documentation of how his surveyor had accounted for the loss of that reference point before his boundary claim could be considered authoritative. She said this clearly and without raising her voice, and she had documents. She actually had documents. She reached into a cloth bag at her feet and produced 3 folded papers, which she held up and identified by date and source, while the room remained in its stunned quiet. When she finished, the silence held for another 2 or 3 seconds before it broke into a wave of murmuring that was distinctly different in character from the angry noise that had preceded it. This was the murmur of people recalibrating. Portman's smile, which had not wavered through the entire presentation, showed a crack at one corner. "The young lady makes some interesting points," he said, deploying that particular brand of condescension that men use when they are rattled but not yet ready to show it. "But I'm not sure she fully understands the legal complexities." "She understands them better than you're counting on," said Clement from the back of the room, and several people laughed, and the laughter broke the spell that Portman had been carefully weaving for the past hour and 20 minutes. After the meeting, which concluded inconclusively, but with a vote to postpone any decisions pending a new survey conducted by a county-appointed surveyor, rather than one hired by Galt's company, Birdie was standing outside in the late afternoon heat, folding her documents back into her bag, when a shadow fell across the dust at her feet. She looked up and found Clement Whitfield standing before her with his hat now properly on his head, and an expression on his face that she would later describe to her neighbor, Nora Beecham, as somewhere between impressed and uncertain. "Birdie Dugan," she said, because she believed in introductions and he was simply standing there. "Clement Whitfield," he said, "foreman at the Rocking W. I'm sorry I didn't catch your name before I spoke up." "You spoke up before I'd said anything," she pointed out, "so that's understandable." "I spoke up because you'd been trying to get the floor for 6 minutes and nobody was paying attention," he said. "I hope that wasn't overstepping." Birdie considered him for a moment. There was something genuinely careful about the way he said it, a real question underneath the words, not politeness covering arrogance but actual curiosity about whether he had done the right thing. She found she respected that more than she would have expected to. "It wasn't overstepping," she said. "It was useful. Where did you learn to whistle like that?" Something shifted in his face that might have been the beginning of a smile. "Cattle," he said simply. She laughed, which surprised both of them. It was a real laugh, sudden and unguarded, and it did something to the expression on Clement Whitfield's face that she did not quite catch before she looked back down at her bag. "Your argument was right," he said when she had finished laughing. "About the survey point. I didn't know about the fire, but I knew something was wrong with those documents." "How did you know?" "Because I've ridden that land," he said. "I know where the water runs. The boundary Portman was claiming doesn't match the ground." She looked up at him again, properly this time, and found that he was looking back at her with the same directness, and that what she had first taken for simple confidence was something more complex. A man who had learned to read situations carefully because he'd had to, and who was applying that same attentiveness to her now. It was, she realized, slightly unnerving. She was accustomed to being either overlooked or condescended to, and this was neither. "The county surveyor will need someone who knows the land," she said. "Someone who can ride it with him and point to the actual landmarks that are still standing." "I can do that," Clement said without hesitation. "So can I," said Birdie. There was a pause. He looked at her with that measuring attention again, and she held it without flinching. "Then I suppose," he said, "we'd better go together." The survey was scheduled for the following Thursday, which gave Birdie and Clement 6 days in which to separately prepare and to notice, with some degree of private confusion, that they were thinking about the other person rather more than the survey warranted. Birdie noticed it first on Saturday morning, when she was working on the irrigation ditch that Thomas had started, and she was determined to finish. She was calculating the best angle for the water diversion, and found herself wondering what Clement Whitfield would think of her plan, which was a peculiar thing to wonder about a man she had spoken to for perhaps 10 minutes total. She dismissed the thought and drove her spade into the earth with unnecessary force. Clement noticed it on Sunday after church, when Reverend Tolliver was delivering a perfectly reasonable sermon about stewardship and community, and Clement spent 20 minutes of it thinking about the particular way the woman in the blue dress had laughed outside the Elks Hall, sudden and real, and completely without calculation. He had spent time in the company of women who laughed carefully, who modulated their amusement for effect, and this had been nothing like that. It had been the laugh of a person who had been genuinely surprised by something funny and had responded to it honestly. He found it difficult to stop thinking about. On Monday morning, purely on the basis of needing to discuss the survey route, he rode out to her 40 acres. The farmstead was less rough than he had expected, which itself told him something. The house was small, a single-story construction of the same native limestone that appeared throughout this part of Texas, with a covered porch where someone had planted a climbing rose that was making determined progress up the left-hand post despite the heat and the drought. The fields were dry, but they had been worked, the soil turned, and the rose maintained, and the half-finished irrigation ditch he could see running along the north edge of the property showed real engineering intelligence in its placement. He stood at the fence line for a moment taking this in before he called out. Birdie came around from behind the house with dirt on her hands and a look of genuine surprise that immediately sharpened into something more guarded. She had not expected visitors, and certainly not this one. "Mr. Whitfield," she said. "Miss Dugan," he said, then corrected himself. "Mrs. Dugan, I apologize, I wasn't sure of the address." "It's Birdie," she said, because she had never much liked the formality of widows' titles. "What brings you out here?" He explained about the survey route, that he thought they ought to agree on which landmarks to present to the county surveyor before Thursday, so as not to contradict each other by accident. It was a logical reason and also entirely true, and they both understood without saying so that it was only partially the reason he had come. She invited him onto the porch, which was cooler than the open air, and brought out a pitcher of water because coffee beans were expensive, and she was not going to pretend otherwise for the sake of appearances. He sat in the one chair that wasn't mended with wire and looked at the rose climbing the post and said it was a fine plant, and she said it had been her mother's cutting, and she'd been hauling it from town to town since she was 19. "Where did you come from?" he asked, and she told him. Ohio originally, then Kansas, then here, following Thomas's determination to find good farmland which they had eventually found in Texas and then not had long enough to benefit from. "I'm sorry about your husband," Clement said, and he said it the way people say things they mean, plainly and without embellishment. "Thank you," she said, equally plain. "It's been over a year, I'm managing." "I can see that," he said, and gestured toward the ditch and the fields, and she realized he was paying her a compliment without constructing one, just stating what he observed, and she found she liked that better than any amount of pretty language. They talked for 2 hours about the survey, which took perhaps 30 minutes of those 2 hours, and the rest of it ranged across weather and water rights and the general situation in Caldwell Creek, and what she had read in the General Land Office letter, and what he had seen riding the eastern pasture over 6 years. He was a good listener, which she had not expected, and he asked questions that showed he was actually processing what she said rather than simply waiting for her to finish. She was a good explainer, which he had already known from the meeting hall, but in conversation she was more than that. She was quick and associative and occasionally funny in a dry, sideways way that caught him off guard and delighted him. When he rode away in the late morning, she stood on the porch and watched the dust settle behind his horse and felt something she had not felt in a long time, which was the particular kind of unease that comes not from danger, but from the prospect of caring about something new. Thursday came, and with it the county surveyor, a methodical man named Gerald Foss who wore spectacles and kept precise notes, and was deeply grateful to have 2 knowledgeable people walking the land with him, rather than arguing over maps in an office. Birdie and Clement rode out together at dawn, meeting at the fence line where their preparedness had first been established, and spent the day alongside Foss traversing the tributary boundary. It was a long day, hot and dusty, and it required the kind of practical cooperation that strips away social pretension very efficiently. They showed Foss the standing landmarks, the limestone outcropping at the bend of the creek, The old Milligan fence post still sunk in the ground, though the fence was gone. The place where the creek split and rejoined around a sand bar that had been documented in the original 1874 survey, and was still exactly where it had been recorded. Birdie read from her documents and Clement walked the ground, and between them, they built a case that was grounded in actual physical reality, rather than convenient legal abstraction. At midday they stopped by the creek in the shade of a stand of cottonwoods, different trees from the burned one in Portman's documents, young and alive and throwing decent shade, and ate the lunches they had each brought separately. Birdie had hard biscuits and dried beef and an apple. Clement had cornbread and cold beans and 2 apples, and he gave her one without making a ceremony of it, which she accepted for the same reason. They sat on opposite sides of a flat limestone rock that served as a table, and Foss sat slightly apart with his notes, and Birdie said, "Do you think Galt will accept the new survey?" Clement said, "No, but it won't matter what he accepts. It'll be on record." "He'll find another way to push," she said. "He will," Clement agreed. "Men like that always do." He looked at her steadily. "But now everyone in Caldwell Creek knows those documents were questionable. That's not nothing." "It's not nothing," she agreed, and they held each other's eyes for a moment over the flat limestone rock, and then both of them looked at the creek. The creek was beautiful in the midday light, running shallow and clear over pale stones, and Birdie looked at it with the particular emotion of someone who has been fighting for something so long they have almost forgotten to notice the thing itself. This was what she was fighting for. The water that would run through her ditch and feed her fields and make the 40 acres her husband had died owning into something that could sustain her. She felt the weight of it settle in her chest, not unpleasantly. "You're going to make that ditch work," Clement said, and she turned to look at him, startled. "I was just thinking about it," she said. "I know," he said. "You were looking at the water the way people look at things they've decided about." He paused. "The angle you've got it set at on the north edge I noticed when I came out Monday. The grade is going to work." She stared at him. "You assessed the grade." "Couldn't help it," he said, with a small apologetic gesture. "I've done a fair amount of irrigation planning at the Rocking W. It's something I notice." "Did you think I'd gotten it wrong?" "I thought you'd gotten it exactly right," he said simply. She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had whistled a room into silence so she could speak, who had ridden out to her farm not purely for the survey, who had noticed the grade of her ditch and assessed it and found it correct and thought nothing of telling her so. She felt something warm and complicated moving in her chest, and she was not quite ready to name it, but she didn't look away from him, and he didn't look away from her. Gerald Foss cleared his throat and said he thought they ought to get back to the survey before the light changed, and they both agreed immediately and stood up, and the moment passed, but it left something behind. The new survey was completed and filed with the county by the end of July, and its findings, delivered in Foss's careful, precise language, were unambiguous. The tributary boundary had not moved. Portman's survey document had, in fact, used the burned cottonwoods recorded position from 1874 without accounting for its destruction, which rendered its measurements from that reference point entirely unreliable. The county commissioner, a man named Abel Trask who had been trying to avoid the whole controversy for 2 months, was compelled by the clarity of the evidence to rule that the Galt Land and Cattle Company's boundary claim on the southwestern tributary was not supported by the available documentation. Harrison Galt received this ruling in his office above the mercantile he had purchased the previous spring, and he sat with it for a long time, his fingers very still on the surface of his desk, and then he told Portman to find another approach. News of the ruling spread through Caldwell Creek within hours, and the reaction was, for the most part, relief. The smaller farmers and homesteaders who had been quietly terrified of losing water access gathered at the Elks Hall that evening, not for an official meeting, but simply because the hall was where people went when they had news to share, and the atmosphere was cautiously celebratory. Amos Pickering shook Birdie's hand for a long time and said she had done good work. Several of the other farmers' wives embraced her. A man named Delbert Crane, who had not spoken a word at the original meeting, told her that she had said what all of them had been thinking, but hadn't known how to put into words. Clement stood near the doorway again, as was apparently his custom, but this time he was smiling, fully and openly, in a way that changed his face considerably. When their eyes met across the room, his smile shifted slightly, became something more specific and directed, and Birdie felt the warmth in her chest again, and this time let herself acknowledge it. After the gathering broke up and people drifted home into the warm summer night, Clement fell into step beside her on the boardwalk. The street was lit by a quarter moon and the light from several windows, and it was, in its plain Texas way, beautiful. "How does it feel?" he asked. "Good," she said. "Strange. I keep waiting for something else to go wrong." "Something else probably will," he said honestly. "Galt isn't finished." "I know," she said, "but tonight it feels good." They walked together for half a block in comfortable silence, which was itself a kind of statement about where they were with each other, that the silence was comfortable rather than obligated. "I'd like to come and help with the ditch," he said then, "if you'd let me. My days off are Sunday and occasional Saturdays." She stopped walking and looked at him in the moonlight. He had stopped too and was waiting with the same patient, unanxious directness that seemed to be simply his nature. "That's work," she said. "Not a small thing." "I know what a ditch is," he said. "Why would you spend your time off digging someone else's irrigation ditch?" He seemed to consider this seriously rather than deflecting it. "Because it's good work," he said finally, "and because I'd like to spend the time." He paused. "With you." The last two words were quietly said but completely unambiguous, and Birdie stood on the Caldwell Creek boardwalk in the warm July night and understood that she was at a threshold of some kind, and that what she said next would matter. "Sunday," she said. "You can come Sunday." The smile that crossed Clement Whitfield's face then was the best thing she had seen in a long time. He came Sunday, and the following Sunday, and the Sunday after that. He came with his work clothes on and his own spade, and without any pretension that it was anything other than what it was, which was a man finding reasons to be in a particular woman's company while also doing genuinely useful work. Birdie had been alone on those 40 acres for 14 months and had grown used to the silence of solitary labor, but she found that she did not miss the silence when Clement was there. They worked well together in the natural, unpretentious way of people who have compatible habits, and they talked while they worked in the way that people talk when they are doing something physical together, in fragments and returns and comfortable interruptions, building a conversation across an afternoon the way you build a wall, one stone at a time. She told him about Ohio and about her father's schoolroom, and about the particular education she had gotten from a man who believed that ignorance was the greatest preventable tragedy, and had accordingly taught his daughters to read everything they could get their hands on. Clement told her about growing up in the eastern part of the state, the son of a man who had ranched, and a woman who had made him understand that ranching was not a destiny but a choice, and how he had made the choice genuinely rather than by default, how he loved the work and the land and the particular intelligence required to manage cattle and water and weather and men. By the third Sunday the ditch was nearly finished, and by the fourth it was done, and Birdie stood at the head of it and watched the water from the tributary begin to run along the channel she and Thomas had planned and she and Clement had completed, and she cried a little quietly, with her back to him, and he stood nearby and did not say anything and did not pretend he hadn't noticed. And when she turned around he handed her his handkerchief, and she took it and blew her nose thoroughly, and they both pretended this was entirely normal, which was, she reflected later, the most genuinely kind thing anyone had done for her in a very long time. Thomas would have liked this, she said, and felt the rightness of saying it. "Tell me about him," Clement said simply, so she did. She told him about Thomas Dugan, who had been a good man and a hopeful one, who had wanted nothing in the world so much as good land and a chance to work it, who had not been a complicated person but had been a steady one, whose death had been quick and unkind, and had left her with grief and 40 acres, and the specific loneliness of someone who has been partnered and then is not. She talked for a while, and Clement listened with the quality of attention that she had come to recognize as simply him, present and unhurried and genuinely interested. When she finished, he said, "He sounds like a man who deserved more time." "He did," she said. "They all do." They stood for a moment watching the water run in the new ditch, and then Clement said, "May I ask you something?" "You may ask me anything," she said, which was true. "Do you think there's room," he said carefully, "for someone new, not to replace what you had, just alongside it?" She looked at the water running in the ditch that Thomas had planned and she had finished, and Clement had helped her finish. And she thought about how things accumulate rather than replace each other. How the rose on the porch post was her mother's, and the ditch was Thomas's, and the irrigation angle was hers, and Clement had assessed the grade and found it correct, and how none of these things canceled any other thing out. "I think there might be room," she said carefully, "depending on the someone." Clement looked at her with the dark, steady eyes that she had now looked into many times across limestone rocks and ditch lines and meeting hall crowds, and said, "Then I'd very much like to be considered." "You're being considered," she said, and he smiled at the ground, which she found she liked very much. August came in hot and dry, and the situation with Harrison Galt became complicated again, as Clement had predicted it would. Galt had found a different approach, as men like Galt do. Rather than challenging the survey directly, he began quietly buying up the debt notes held by the Caldwell Creek Savings Bank, which had extended small loans to many of the homesteaders during the difficult years of 1880 and 1881, when the drought had been particularly severe. By the middle of August, Galt held paper on 11 different properties in the valley, and he began calling those notes in with a regularity that was clearly strategic rather than simply financial. The people affected were the same people who had cheered the survey ruling. Delbert Crane lost his eastern 20 acres when he couldn't make the payment. The Harmon brothers, who farmed together on a shared property north of town, were given 60 days to produce money they did not have. Amos Pickering, who had no debt of his own but whose neighbor Lucinda Fry was about to lose her property to a called note, came to find Birdie on a Tuesday morning looking 20 years older than he had at the celebration. Birdie was not in debt. Thomas had been particular about that, had refused the bank loans that his neighbors had taken, had driven himself and her harder instead, and they had managed barely without borrowing. But she understood immediately what Galt was doing and what it would mean for the community around her, and she felt the injustice of it with a physical clarity, the way you feel the sun on your skin. She went to find Clement that afternoon. He was working in the rocking W's north pasture when she rode up on the old bay mare she kept for riding when walking wasn't practical. He saw her coming from a distance, and the way she sat the horse and the set of her shoulders told him before she reached him that something had happened. She explained about the debt notes. She had already been to the county clerk's office that morning. This was the kind of woman she was, and she had a list of which properties were affected and which notes Galt now held. Clement read through her list twice, his jaw getting tighter. "He can do this legally," he said. "He can," she said. "That's the problem." "What's your thought?" he asked, because he had learned that she always had won. "I think we need to get people together, not to fight him in a meeting hall this time, to organize around the bank." She spread her hands in a frustrated gesture. If people can pool resources, even small amounts, toward the payments, it might be enough to keep the worst of them from losing their land while they find a longer-term solution. Some of these farms, the notes are small, $80, $120. "That's not small for most people out here," he said. "I know, but it might be small if enough people contribute something." She looked at him steadily. "And I know some people won't want to be seen helping, because Galt has made it clear what happens to people who cross him, which is why I need someone that people in this town respect." He understood what she was asking. "You're asking me to lend my name to this." "And your effort," she said. "Yes, I know it's a risk for you too. The Rocking W doesn't have a note with Galt's bank, but Jacob Whitmore has contracts that Galt could complicate." Clement was quiet for a moment, and she let him be. She had learned that his silences were not evasions but actual thought, and that what came out of them was generally worth waiting for. "Jacob Whitmore is a fair man," Clement said finally. "He would not want to stand by and watch neighbors lose their land to a speculator if there was something to be done." He folded her list and put it in his shirt pocket. "Let me talk to him tonight. Give me until tomorrow morning." Jacob Whitmore was indeed a fair man, and he was also a man who had seen speculators like Galt work their way through communities before, in the years after the war, in the chaotic land redistribution that had ruined good people up and down the state. He was bedridden but not without resources, and he told Clement that he would put $300 toward the effort, and that Clement should use his own judgment about how to proceed, because that was what he was paying Clement for. $300 was not enough to cover everything, but it was enough to start, and Clement and Birdie together spent the next 2 weeks doing something that neither of them had ever done before, which was going farm to farm and door to door through the county, sitting at kitchen tables and on porch steps, explaining the situation and asking people to contribute what they could, 50 cents, $2, whatever was possible, toward a community fund that would be managed by a small committee and used to help neighbors make their debt payments to Galt's newly acquired bank. It was intimate work, going into people's homes and talking about money, which is what is underneath most things in any community but is rarely discussed directly. Some people contributed readily and were clearly relieved to have an action to take. Some were skeptical or afraid and needed more time and convincing. A few refused entirely, either because they had nothing to give or because they were more frightened of Galt than they were willing to say openly. Birdie and Clement took no for an answer and moved on without pressure, because the point was to help people rather than to shame them. They spent long days riding together through the county in the August heat, and in the evenings they sat on Birdie's porch in the cooling air and reviewed their list and planned the next day's route. On these evenings they talked about everything and nothing, about the people they had visited, and the lives that were visible in small ways through kitchen table conversations, about the land and the weather and the particular quality of the light in September in Texas, which was different from August in a way that was hard to describe but unmistakable. They ate the simple food that Birdie made, corn bread and dried beans, and whatever vegetables she had managed to coax from her kitchen garden, and Clement brought things when he could, a piece of salt pork from the Rocking W stores, a sack of coffee beans, twice a jar of honey from somewhere he didn't specify. On the third evening of the second week, sitting in the 2 porch chairs as the stars came out over the flat Texas plain, Clement said, "I think I'm falling in love with you," and his voice was level and quiet, and he was looking at the stars rather than at her, which was the most honest thing about it. Birdie was quiet for a moment. The crickets were very loud. The rose on the left-hand post smelled faintly in the night air. "I think I've been falling for some time," she said, just as quietly, and she was also looking at the stars. He reached across the space between the 2 chairs and took her hand, her calloused, work-roughened hand in his equally work-roughened hand, and they sat like that for a while without saying anything more about it, because it had been said and that was sufficient for now. And the stars over the Texas plain were very good and the air was cool, and the crickets were loud and everything felt, for that particular hour, entirely right. The fund they had built reached $740 by the middle of September, combined with Jacob Whitmore's initial contribution. It was not a grand sum, but it was enough, with careful allocation, to address the most immediate debt notes and give 11 families breathing room. They held a small meeting, not in the Elks Hall this time but at the church, where Reverend Tolliver lent them the space and his moral authority, and the Community Fund Committee was formally established with 4 members including Birdie and old Amos Pickering, and 2 other farmers who were trusted and practical. Harrison Galt, when he heard about it, made several predictable noises about community interference with legitimate business practice. But there was nothing legally wrong with neighbors helping neighbors pay legitimate debts, and Portman told him so. And Galt sat again at his desk with his fingers still on its surface and thought of other approaches. The approach he settled on was one that Birdie had not anticipated, and that hit her in a personal rather than a collective way. He found her water right. Not the tributary boundary which the survey had settled, something older. He found in the original land records a filing discrepancy, an administrative error in Thomas Dugan's original homestead registration from 1878, a failure to properly record the water access addendum that should have been filed alongside the land patent. It was a bureaucratic mistake, the kind that happened in a land office handling hundreds of filings simultaneously in the boom years of the late 1870s, and in normal circumstances, it would have been correctable with a simple amended filing. But Galt's lawyer had found it, and they had moved quickly, and before Birdie knew what was happening, there was a legal challenge filed claiming that the Dugan homestead's water rights had never been properly established under Texas law. She found out on a Thursday in early October when a notice was posted on her fence line, and she stood at her fence in the morning light reading it, and felt the ground shift under her feet in a way that had nothing to do with the earth. She had time. The notice gave her 30 days to respond, but 30 days was not long enough to fight a land filing dispute without a lawyer, and lawyers in Caldwell Creek were Portman's colleagues and could not be hired against him, which meant finding someone from another town, which cost money she did not have in significant amounts. She was sitting at her kitchen table with the notice in front of her when Clement knocked on her open door that evening. He had been at the Rocking W all day and had heard the news from Amos Pickering, who had ridden out to find him when he heard. He came in and sat across from her and read the notice and set it down with the same controlled stillness he applied to most things, but his eyes, when he looked at her, were darker than usual. "He went after you specifically," he said. "Because I started it," she said. "The meeting, the survey, the fund, he's making an example." "Then we fight it," Clement said. "It costs. I know what it costs," he said. "I have savings." He said it directly as a fact, not as an offer constructed for dramatic effect. 6 years as foreman, living simply. "I have savings." "Clement," she said. "Let me help," he said. "Not because I think you can't manage it. Because I don't want you to have to manage it alone, and I am, if you'll permit me to use the word, invested." She looked at him across the kitchen table, this man who had whistled a room into silence, who had assessed the grade of her ditch and dug it with her on his days off, who had ridden half the county at her side asking neighbors for 50 cents and $2, who had said he was falling in love with her while looking at the stars, who was now sitting at her kitchen table offering his savings as straightforwardly as he offered everything else. "I permit you to use the word," she said softly. They spent 2 days writing to lawyers in Abilene and found one, a man named Harmon Seal, who specialized in land disputes and who agreed to take the case for a reasonable fee once Clement wrote to explain the situation in full. Seal came to Caldwell Creek on the train in mid-October and spent a day with Birdie reviewing her documents, which she had, as always, thoroughly organized, and concluded that while the filing discrepancy was genuine, it was the kind of administrative error that had specific remedies under Texas property law, and that the Dugan homestead's water rights could be established by a combination of the amended filing and a demonstration of continuous beneficial use, which meant that Birdie had been using the water consistently since inheriting the property. The case was filed in the county court, and a hearing was scheduled for November. In the meantime, Galt made no further moves, which Birdie found more unnerving than action, the sense of a man waiting rather than spent. October settled the landscape into something gentler. the grass going gold and the sky losing the brutal blue of summer for something softer and higher, and the mornings carrying a pleasant chill that made work feel more possible. Birdie's fields were in their autumn state, the summer's thin harvest gathered, the ground resting for the following year which she hoped, with the irrigation ditch now completed and tested, would be considerably better. She and Clement spent October in the particular happiness of two people who have acknowledged something important between them and are now learning what that means in daily life. He continued to come on Sundays, though there was no more ditch work to do, and the visits were frankly social rather than labor-constructed now, which felt both natural and slightly exhilarating. They rode out together sometimes, across the golden October plain, the horses moving at an easy pace, and the conversation moving the same way, wide and ranging, and full of the curiosity that people feel about another person when they are genuinely interested in who that person is rather than who they would prefer them to be. He told her about his family, parents who were gone now, a sister in San Antonio he corresponded with regularly, a childhood that had been poor in money and rich in the things that do not require money. She told him about her father's death 5 years prior and the way it had made her feel, for a long time, like the anchor had lifted, the fixed point against which she had always known where she was. She was surprised, telling this, by how accurately he seemed to understand it for a man who had lost both parents before 30. "You fix the point yourself after a while," he said. "It takes time, but you do." "Is that what you did?" she asked. "More or less," he said. "Work helped." Having something that needed doing, he looked across the plain for a moment. "Land helps. I've always felt more anchored when I can look at something and know the water table and the grass conditions and what the weather coming in from the northwest is likely to do to it. Knowing a piece of ground." He paused. "I think that's part of why I like being on your land. Your 40 acres. I've got to know it." She felt something warm and particular about the way he said that, your 40 acres, the simple matter-of-fact acknowledgement that it was hers, unqualified. "I love it," she said simply. "Even when it's difficult." "Especially when it's difficult," he said, with a small smile that she had come to know well. "Especially when it's difficult," she agreed. On a Sunday afternoon in late October, with the light lying long and golden across her porch, and the rose on the post beginning to prepare for winter in its gradual climbing withdrawal of color, Clement kissed her for the first time. It happened very naturally, the way things happen when they have been approaching for long enough, mid-conversation, something about the light and the way she had turned to look at him when she laughed, and he had leaned in and she had met him, and it was unhurried and genuine, and afterwards they both sat for a moment looking at the plain, in the particular silence of people reconfiguring themselves around something new. "Good," she said, which was not the most romantic word in the English language but was entirely accurate. "Yes," he said, and reached for her hand again. November came cold and clear, and the court hearing for the water rights case fell on a Tuesday in the second week of the month. Birdie appeared with Harmon Seal, and a folder of documents that was now so comprehensive that Seal had described it privately to Clement as the most organized presentation he had seen from a non-lawyer in 20 years of practice. Galt appeared with Portman and 2 associates from Dallas, and a general air of confident power that he had apparently decided would substitute for having an actually superior legal argument. The judge was a man named Willard Chesley, who had been in Caldwell Creek for 8 years, and was not given to being impressed by expensive suits or confident postures. He was, however, given to being impressed by clear documentation and the kind of solid, factual argument that left no room for alternative interpretation. Seal presented the case for 2 hours. Birdie testified for 40 minutes and answered Portman's cross-examination with a patience and precision that made one of Galt's associates take a note. Clement testified about what he had observed of the property's water use over the past years from his vantage point on the adjacent Rocking W land. Amos Pickering testified as a neighbor who had been aware of Thomas Dugan's original land filing and the subsequent administration of the property. Portman's argument was that the filing discrepancy was disqualifying, and that the beneficial use doctrine required a specific filing to be operative rather than mere practice. Seal's counter was methodical and precise, and grounded in 3 specific Texas Supreme Court precedents that had addressed similar administrative errors in homestead filings, all of which had come down in favor of the established property holder rather than the challenging party, provided that continuous beneficial use could be demonstrated. Judge Chesley took 20 minutes to deliberate, which was long enough to seem serious and short enough to suggest he was not particularly conflicted. He ruled in favor of Birdie Dugan on all points. The water rights were confirmed, the administrative error was noted as correctable by amended filing, the challenge was dismissed. He said from the bench that the original filing error was the kind of bureaucratic oversight that was common in the land rush years, and that the proper remedy was always correction rather than confiscation, and that he found no basis in Texas law or common justice for using an administrative error to dispossess a widow who had been working her land in good faith for over 2 years. Portman's face was very smooth and controlled when the ruling came down, which told Birdie more than a visible reaction would have. Galt left Caldwell Creek in January of the following year, 1883. He sold his holdings in the county, not all of them. He retained the mercantile and 2 of the larger ranch properties, but the land and cattle company was folded into a different entity headquartered in Dallas, and his personal presence in Caldwell Creek became occasional, and then rare, and then absent. Several years later, Birdie heard he had moved his operations to New Mexico territory and had a similar dispute going with ranchers there. She felt sorry for those ranchers, but not excessively so. What Galt's departure did for Caldwell Creek was ease something in the air, some tension that had become so habitual people had forgotten it was tension until it was gone. The community fund that Birdie and Clement had organized was wound down carefully over the winter, with debts addressed and remaining funds distributed back to contributors, and the committee that had managed it became the informal core of a new sort of civic engagement in the town that was less reactive and more purposeful. Birdie spent the winter preparing her fields for the spring with the full benefit of the completed irrigation ditch and the confirmed water right, and she spent it also in the company of Clement Whitfield, who was by now a constant and natural presence in her life in the way that things become constant and natural when they have been tested and found genuine. He asked her to marry him in December, on a cold Sunday afternoon when the sky was a flat pewter gray, and the prairie grass was brittle and pale, and the only color anywhere was the rose hips on her porch post, still red in the winter landscape. He did it plainly, as he did most things, not on one knee with theatrical construction, but standing at the fence line of her 40 acres looking across the ground they had both come to know well, saying that he loved her and that he wanted to spend his life in her company, and on this land if she would have him, and that he understood if she needed time, but that he wanted her to know the question was there. She had known the question was coming for some time. She had been considering it in the private part of her mind for most of the autumn, turning it over with the same careful attention she brought to land surveys and water right filings and irrigation angles, which is to say with both her analytical mind and the deeper part of her that knew what the analysis was in service of. She said yes. She said it immediately and clearly, and then she said, "I was wondering when you were going to ask," which made him laugh, and it was the first time she had heard him really laugh, openly and freely, and it was an extraordinary thing to have caused. They were married in February of 1883 in the Caldwell Creek Church, with Reverend Tolliver officiating and Nora Beecham standing up with Birdie and Jacob Whitmore's son Henry standing up with Clement, because Jacob himself could not manage the church steps with his hip. The wedding was modest in the way that all Texas weddings in 1883 tended to be. The church decorated with dried flowers and dried grasses, because February offered nothing fresh, and the reception held in the Elks Hall with food contributed by the community in the potluck manner of the frontier. Old Amos Pickering gave a toast that began with the water rights case and ended somewhere near the philosophy of love, which was more than anyone had expected from Amos, and people clapped enthusiastically, and Birdie cried briefly, and Clement's hand on her back was warm and steady. They spent their wedding night in her house, which would now become their house, and in the morning Clement looked at the 40 acres in the clear February light and said, "I'd like to talk to Jacob Whitmore about the future," by which he meant that he was considering leaving the Rocking W to work the Dugan land full-time, which was a significant decision and one they needed to make together. They talked about it for several weeks with the thoroughness that characterized all their serious discussions, working through the financial reality and the practical logistics. Clement had his savings, reduced by Harmon Seal's fees but still substantial. The Dugan land with full water access and the completed irrigation system had real potential if properly developed, more than a homestead, something approaching a small farm with market possibilities. Jacob Whitmore, when Clement spoke with him, was characteristically gracious about it, said he had expected something like this and had been planning for it, and offered Clement a part-time arrangement through the spring to allow for a proper transition. By the summer of 1883, Clement Whitfield was no longer foreman of the Rocking W. He was the co-farmer of 40 acres of Texas Panhandle land, which had been expanded by the purchase of the adjacent 12 acres from a departing neighbor, giving them a total of 52 acres with good water access and a functioning irrigation system, and 2 people who understood the land and each other and were genuinely happy in the work. The summer's harvest was the best the land had produced in years. The irrigation ditch that Birdie had planned and she and Clement had completed ran clear and steady, and the fields that Thomas Dugan had broken from native ground gave back that summer in corn and winter wheat and a kitchen garden of extraordinary productivity. Birdie stood at the edge of the north field in August and looked across the green, growing things in the dry Texas heat, and felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for a long time. Clement came up beside her and stood looking at the same view with the expression he got when he was satisfied, which was different from his ordinary expression in subtle ways that she had learned to read over the past year. "Thomas would have loved this," he said, using her words from the day the ditch was finished. "He would have," she said, and reached for his hand without looking at it, the way you do when you know exactly where someone's hand is. "You both did this," he said. "You planned it. He started it. You finished it." "We finished it," she corrected. "We finished it," he agreed. In October of 1883, Birdie told Clement she was expecting their first child. She told him at the kitchen table in the morning before the day's work started, as matter-of-factly as possible, partly because she believed in matter-of-fact communication, and partly because she was still sorting through her own complicated mixture of joy and anxiety, and didn't trust herself to be dramatic about it without losing the thread. Clement went very still in the way he went still when he was processing something significant, and then he stood up from the table and came around to her side, and held her face in his large, careful hands, and looked at her with an expression that she later tried several times to describe to Nora Beecham, and could not quite find words for, because it was too full of too many things at once. "Good," he said, which was the word she had used after the first kiss, and they both recognized it and laughed, and the laughter made everything easier. He was, as she would have predicted if she had thought to predict it, the best possible person to go through a pregnancy alongside. He was attentive without being anxious, practical in his support, and completely uninterested in treating her as though she had become suddenly fragile, which was the treatment she had most feared. He did take over the heavier field work without making a production of it, and he learned to cook 3 or 4 reliable meals so that the days when nausea made cooking impossible were managed. And he lay awake with her on the nights when she couldn't sleep and talked, or simply lay quietly beside her in the dark, which was sometimes what she needed more than conversation. Their son was born in June of 1884, on a warm morning when the mockingbirds were very loud outside the window, and the light coming in was the color of early summer. He was a strong, direct baby who announced himself with great confidence, and then, once cleaned and wrapped and placed in Birdie's arms, looked around at the world with dark eyes that were Clement's in miniature. They named him James Thomas Whitfield, the James for Clement's father and the Thomas because it was right. Clement held his son for the first time with the same quality of stillness he brought to all significant things, and his face did the complicated, many-layered thing it had done. When Birdie told him she was expecting, only more so, and Birdie watched him from the bed with a tiredness that was very deep and a happiness that was very clear, and thought that of all the things she had managed in her life, she was most proud of this one. James Thomas was a vigorous and curious child who was walking at 10 months and dismantling everything he could reach at 11, and who developed by age 2 a complete fascination with horses that seemed less like a preference and more like a recognition. Clement, who had spent his life around horses, watched his son's absolute confidence around the large animals with a mixture of paternal pride and careful vigilance, and began teaching him from the very beginning the respect that was required alongside the affinity. The years from 1884 to 1888 were good years for the Whitfield farm, which was what people had begun calling it, the Whitfield farm, though Birdie kept the Dugan name on the original land patent because it was Thomas's, and she believed in honoring things properly. They expanded the fields incrementally, always within what the water system and their labor could sustain, and added a small dairy operation with 4 cows that Birdie managed with the same systematic intelligence she brought to everything, which turned out to produce a very reliable income in addition to the crop money. The community fund committee that she and Amos Pickering had established became a more formal organization, a kind of mutual aid society that most of the farmers and homesteaders in the county eventually joined, with dues and bylaws and an elected board. Birdie served on the board for 4 years and was its chair for 2 of them, and the organization she helped build was still functioning and useful 20 years later, though she was not to know that yet. Clement became a quietly essential figure in Caldwell Creek without ever seeking to be, the way some people become essential, through reliability and competence, and the habit of being genuinely useful when things went wrong. He was the person called when a neighbor's barn had structural problems, when a dispute needed mediating, when someone needed to know what the weather coming from the northwest was going to do, and whether the cattle should be moved. He brought to this role the same qualities he had always had: directness, patience, genuine attentiveness, and no particular interest in credit. In 1887 they had their second child, a daughter born in March, whom they named Clara Rose, the rose for the climbing plant still on the porch post, now thick and established and covering most of the left side of the porch in its season. Clara was, from the very beginning, a person who understood what she wanted and pursued it with cheerful relentlessness, which Nora Beecham said was obviously her mother in her, and Clement said without hesitation was the best possible thing she could be. James, 4 years older, became Clara's devoted champion and occasional exasperated guardian, a role he performed with the unconscious gravity of an older child who takes the responsibility seriously without having been asked to. And watching them together was one of the recurring pure pleasures of Birdie and Clement's life. On a summer evening in 1888, sitting on the porch that now had the rose covering most of its front, and a new addition to the right side of the house that Clement had built the previous autumn to accommodate the growing family, Birdie looked across the 52 acres in the long evening light and thought about the Thursday afternoon in July of 1882, the sweltering meeting hall, the voice she could not get anyone to hear, the hand she had raised and held until her shoulder ached. She thought about the whistle that had cut through the noise, and the quiet voice from the back of the room that had said everyone listened to her. Clement was beside her, as he almost always was in the evenings, in the slightly larger chair he had made because the original one had finally given up under years of wire repairs, with James sitting on the porch steps teaching Clara a complicated game involving pebbles and a system of rules that James was adjusting to favor himself, which Clara had noticed and was protesting with eloquent 4-year-old outrage. "What are you thinking about?" Clement asked the way he asked when he noticed the particular quality of her silence. "The meeting hall," she said. "The first one, when I raised my hand." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the same evening plane she was looking at. "Do you know how long you'd been holding it up before I said anything?" "6 minutes," she said. "You told me." "I've always been sorry about that 6 minutes," he said, "that it took me that long to see it." "You weren't responsible for seeing it," she said. "No," he said, "but I'm glad I did." She leaned sideways in her chair so that her shoulder was against his, the comfortable, unthinking contact of two people who have been beside each other long enough that the boundary between where one ends and the other begins has become pleasantly unclear. "I'm glad you did too," she said. James had apparently rigged the pebble game definitively in his favor, and Clara had abandoned it in favor of a principle-based protest, standing with her hands on her hips, making an argument that her vocabulary was not quite large enough for, but that her conviction more than compensated for. And both of them watched their daughter's small, fierce indignation with the helpless delight of parents who recognize themselves in their children. "She's going to raise her hand in meeting halls," Clement said. "God willing," said Birdie. The stars came out over the Texas plain, the great flat vault of them that was one of the gifts the Panhandle gave without reservation, and the children eventually settled and were brought into bed, and the house was quiet in the way that a house is quiet when it is full of sleeping people, which is the fullest kind of quiet there is. Birdie and Clement sat a little longer on the porch in the dark, her hand in his, the rose on the post a shadow against the lamplight from the window, the fields invisible in the night but present, the water running in the ditch steady and audible if you listened for it, which she always did. In the years that followed, the Whitfield farm grew with the kind of steady, real growth that comes from consistent work and good management, and two people who are genuinely suited to working alongside each other. By 1890, the crop income was supplemented by the dairy income, and by a small but reliable market garden that Birdie ran with a network of sales to the Caldwell Creek merchants that she had personally negotiated, with a directness that the merchants had learned not to mistake for pushover. James Whitfield grew into a boy who had his father's steadiness and his mother's mind, a combination that served him very well, and who by his 12th year was a genuine working member of the farm in ways that went beyond token labor, someone who understood the water system and the crop rotation, and the particular temperaments of the 4 dairy cows with real intelligence. Clara, 8 years behind him, was the kind of child who needed to know why before she would do anything, which was exhausting in the immediate and excellent in the long run, and who was reading at a level that would have made her grandfather, the schoolteacher, profoundly proud. Caldwell Creek itself grew in these years, acquired a second church and a school that was better than the original one and a doctor who came on the train twice monthly, and became less of a frontier town and more of a settled community, which was the natural arc of these places, the frontier becoming ordinary with time and work and enough people deciding to stay. Harrison Galt died in 1891 in a land dispute in New Mexico Territory, not violently but of a heart attack in a courtroom, which people in Caldwell Creek discussed with varying degrees of sympathy, most of it minimal. The land he had held in Caldwell Creek County passed through several owners over the following years, and eventually Much of it was absorbed into the regular farming and ranching community, losing the corporate character that had made it feel threatening. Amos Pickering died in the winter of 1893, at the age of 78, and Birdie sat with his daughter through the evening before the burial and told her what her father had meant to the community and how his willingness to stand up and be counted had made a difference at a time when it mattered. She believed in telling people these things. She had learned from losing her own father that the time to say them was before the person was gone. Nora Beecham married a widower from the next county in 1892 and moved 20 miles away, which was far enough to require planning for visits, but not so far that the friendship suffered materially, and the two women wrote letters with the reliability of people who value each other's minds. On an evening in the autumn of 1894, when James was 10 and Clara was 6, and the farm was in its harvest season, and the irrigation ditch was running with the particular competence of infrastructure that has been maintained with care over a decade, Clement said to Birdie at the kitchen table after the children were in bed that he wanted her to know something. She looked up from the account book she had been reviewing and waited. "I was thinking today," he said, "about what I would be doing if I hadn't gone to that meeting in July of 1882. Still foreman at the Rocking W, probably," she said. "Probably," he said. "That's not what I was thinking about." He folded his hands on the table with the familiar gesture. "I was thinking about the version of my life that doesn't include this. The house, the children, you." He was quiet for a moment. "I can't see it clearly. It seems very gray and very empty, and I don't know how I walked around in it all those years without noticing." Birdie set down her pencil. "You were busy," she said gently. "Was busy," he agreed, "but that's not really it. I think I just hadn't understood yet what it was possible to have." He looked at her across the kitchen table with the dark, steady eyes that she had been looking into for 12 years now and still found she wanted to look into, which seemed to her the best possible evidence that she had made the right decision. "I'm grateful for it every day," he said. "I want you to know that." "I know it," she said. "I know you know it," he said. "I wanted to say it." She reached across the table and covered his folded hands with hers. "Then I'll say it back," she said. "I'm grateful for you every day. For the whistle and the survey and the ditch and all of it." "In that order," he said, and the corner of his mouth went up. "More or less," she said, and they both smiled, and the lamp between them on the kitchen table threw warm light across the account book and the folded hands and the faces of two people who had found each other in a meeting hall in July and had been finding each other ever since, in the small and large ways that constitute a life shared. The kitchen was warm and the house was quiet with the weight of sleeping children, and outside the Panhandle night was vast and full of stars, and the water ran in the ditch Birdie had planned and they had built together, steady and clear in the Texas dark, going where it was meant to go. James Whitfield, at 17, was a young man who carried himself with his father's quiet authority and had his mother's way of walking into a situation and immediately seeing what needed doing. He had taken on the eastern fields as his own responsibility in a way that Clement had encouraged without directing, and the results showed in the care of the soil and the planning of the rotation. Birdie watched her son work his land with the same feeling she always got when she recognized something of herself or Clement in him, which was a warm, complicated pride that had no entirely adequate words. Clara, 13 by this time, had declared her intention to study law. She announced this at the dinner table on a Tuesday in September of 1900, with the directness of someone who has been thinking about this for a long time and has now decided to stop thinking privately and start saying it out loud. She explained that she had been reading about women lawyers in the eastern states, that there were more of them than most people knew about, and that the things her mother had done with the survey and the water rights case and the mutual aid society were legal work, essentially, and she wanted to do legal work the way it was formally done, with a bar license and a courtroom. The table was quiet for a moment. Clement said, "Then we need to think about schooling." Birdie said, "Which women lawyers have you been reading about?" Clara produced a list. It was handwritten and covered most of a page and included dates and jurisdictions, which was her mother's daughter entirely. They talked about it for most of the evening, the practical questions of schooling and distance and cost, and the less practical but equally real questions of what it meant for a girl from a Texas panhandle farm to want to argue cases in a courtroom, what the world would look like when she arrived there, whether it would let her in. Birdie and Clement spoke to these questions with the same honesty they had always applied to difficult things, neither minimizing the obstacles nor treating them as fixed, because they had both spent enough time pushing against fixed-looking things to know they were rarely as fixed as they appeared. "You'll have to work harder than most," Birdie said to her daughter. "You know that." "I know that," Clara said without resentment. "And you'll have to be better prepared than anyone else in the room," Birdie continued, "because you won't be given the benefit of the doubt." "I know that too," Clara said with the particular patience of someone who has already thought about this at length. "Good," said Birdie. "Then let's find you a school." James, who had been listening to this exchange with his customary quietness, said, "I'll take on whatever she can't manage with the farm while she's gone." Clara looked at her brother with genuine gratitude, and then turned back to her parents with the expression of someone receiving confirmation that the ground is solid. By 1901, Clara Whitfield was enrolled in a preparatory academy in San Antonio, the same city where Clement's sister still lived, and who had agreed to board Clara through the school years, which solved the distance problem with an elegance that felt like providence. James ran the eastern fields and took on more of the dairy management, and did it with the competent, undemonstrative thoroughness that was entirely his own character, fully himself, and also, unmistakably, the son of these particular parents. Birdie rode to San Antonio once a year to visit Clara and her sister-in-law, and the letters between mother and daughter were long and detailed, and full of the intellectual exchange that both of them required, Clara writing about what she was learning and Birdie writing back with questions and connections, and the occasional gentle challenge that kept Clara's thinking sharp. Clement, who had begun feeling the years in his back and his hands by 1901, continued to work the land with the modified rhythm of a man who has learned to pace himself without stopping, and spent more time teaching James the particular knowledge that doesn't come from books, the reading of weather and soil, and the behavior of water in different seasons, the accumulated practical intelligence of a life worked outdoors that can only be transmitted through presence and demonstration. On a May morning in 1903, when the farm was at its spring best, green and growing under a sky that had finally and generously produced rain after a difficult dry winter, Birdie stood at the edge of the north field with the sound of the ditch running and the smell of wet earth and flowering things, and thought about all the years stacked behind her like the pages of the account book she had kept since 1883, each year a page, the numbers adding up to something that made sense. Clement came and stood beside her in his habitual way, his shoulder warm against hers. 47 years old, she said, because it was her birthday. "You don't look it," he said, which was not entirely true and also entirely sincere in the way of someone who has loved someone for 21 years and genuinely finds them beautiful on their 47th birthday. "I feel it," she said, but she said it contentedly, not with complaint. "I feel exactly the right amount of 47. He laughed, and it was still, after all this time, one of her favorite sounds. James was married in 1904 to a young woman named Ruth Halley from a farming family 2 counties over, a practical, warm-hearted person who adapted to the Whitfield household with the ease of someone who had been raised understanding that work and warmth were not mutually exclusive. The wedding was in June and the whole community came, because the Whitfields were what they had become in 20 years, a fixed point in Caldwell Creek, and the community turned out for their occasions the way communities do for people who have earned that kind of belonging. Clara came from San Antonio for the wedding, now 20 years old, and studying with a focused intensity that her letters conveyed vividly, still determined, still moving toward the thing she had announced at the dinner table 4 years before. She danced at her brother's wedding with a joy that was complete and unguarded, and sat with her parents afterwards in the way that adult children sit with their parents when they have come home briefly and are feeling the particular tenderness of transience. "Are you happy?" Birdie asked her because she believed in asking directly. "Yes," Clara said, without hesitation. "Tired and working hard and sometimes frightened about whether I'll actually manage it, but yes, happy." "Good," said Birdie. "That's the right kind of answer." Clara looked at her parents sitting together as they always sat, comfortable and close and fundamentally at ease with each other, and said, "How do you do it? 20-some years and you still look at each other like that." Birdie looked at Clement. Clement said, "Like what?" "Like you're still interested in each other," Clara said. "Like you haven't figured everything out yet." Clement smiled at Birdie, and she smiled back, and then she said to her daughter, "I don't think you ever figure everything out with the right person. There's always something more to learn." James and Ruth had their first child in 1905, a boy they named William, and he was born on a spring morning with his grandfather Clement pacing the porch with the particular agitation of a man who has been very patient his whole life and has reached his limit. And when James came out to say it was a boy and everyone was well, Clement sat down on the porch steps with the look of a man who needs a moment. And Birdie came and sat beside him, and he put his arm around her, and they sat together in the fresh spring morning, hearing the new baby crying inside the house. "Listen to that," Clement said. "Healthy," Birdie confirmed, "which was what you listened for." He pressed his face briefly against her hair, in the private way that people who have loved each other a long time can be private even in plain sight. "We did all right," he said. "We did all right," she agreed. Clara Whitfield was admitted to practice law in the state of Texas in 1908, one of a small number of women to achieve this in the state at that time, and she came home to Caldwell Creek for a week to celebrate. And the celebration was genuine and community-wide, and also, underneath the festivity, freighted with the knowledge of what it had cost and what it meant. Birdie held her daughter at the end of the evening when the gathering had broken up and the house was quieting, held her in the way that mothers hold daughters who have achieved something that required them to fight for it, which is different from ordinary holding. "Your grandfather would have been so proud," she said. "So would Thomas," Clara said, which she had always called him, knowing the story and honoring it. "Yes," said Birdie, "so would Thomas." Clement watched his wife and daughter from across the room with the expression that was too full of too many things to describe, and thought about a meeting hall in July of 1882, and a woman with a raised arm and everything that had followed. The survey, and the ditch, and the court, and the marriage, and the children, and the years, and the life they had built from nothing more remarkable than two people who decided to be honest about what they saw and what they wanted. And he thought that if he had known then what it would come to, he would have been afraid of the scale of it, which was probably why you were given it incrementally, one piece at a time, so you could carry it. He caught Birdie's eye across the room, and she looked at him the way she had always looked at him, direct and clear, and with that particular quality of attention that had made him feel seen from the very beginning. And he thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that he was the luckiest man in Caldwell Creek, and that luck was not really the word for it, but it was the closest one he had. The farm was still producing well in 1910, managed now largely by James and Ruth, with Clement in an advisory and oversight role that suited his slower pace and his back, and Birdie managing the accounts and the Mutual Aid Society board, and a new correspondence she had taken up with a group of women in Austin who were working toward suffrage, because she had never been the kind of person who stopped finding things that needed doing. The house had been extended twice, and now had a proper parlor and 4 bedrooms, and a kitchen that was large enough for the extended family gatherings that happened on holidays and harvest time, when James and Ruth and William and the daughter they had added in 1907, a bright, self-possessed child named Eleanor, filled the house with the noise of a working, growing family. Clara had established her law practice in Abilene, where the work was more plentiful, and the community was large enough to sustain a woman lawyer without consuming all of its energy on the novelty of the fact. And she rode the train to Caldwell Creek 6 times a year, arriving with a carpetbag full of work, and a mind full of cases, and a hunger for her mother's cooking that she said no restaurant in Abilene had ever managed to address. On an evening in the autumn of 1911, Birdie and Clement sat on the porch in the familiar arrangement, his chair in hers, her hand in his, the rose on the post heavy with its autumn hips, the fields quiet in the long October light. William, 6 years old, had fallen asleep on the porch floor with his head on a folded blanket, having resisted bed with the comprehensive stubbornness of small children, and then surrendered to gravity when he thought nobody was watching. Birdie looked at her sleeping grandson and at the fields and at the rose and at Clement's profile in the evening light, weathered and familiar and dear. "Do you know what I was thinking about today?" she said. "Tell me," he said. "I was thinking about raising my hand," she said. "In the meeting hall, July of 1882, I was thinking about how frightened I was." He turned to look at her. "Were you frightened?" "Terrified," she said. "I had my arm up and nobody was looking at me, and I kept thinking that nobody was going to look at me and I was going to have to put my arm down and go home with all of it unsaid." She looked at the evening plain. "And then you whistled." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know you were frightened," he said. "You didn't look frightened." "I was," she said. "I was holding the fear very still so it wouldn't show." "That's courage," he said simply. "Or stubbornness," she said. "In my experience they're difficult to tell apart," he said, and she laughed, and it was the same laugh as the one outside the Elks' Hall, sudden and real and unguarded, the laugh of someone genuinely surprised by something funny, and he thought it was still the best thing he had ever heard. The evening deepened and the first stars appeared, and William slept on the porch floor with the complete commitment of early childhood, and the rose hips glowed red in the last light, and the water ran in the ditch, and somewhere in the fields an owl called once and was quiet. Birdie and Clement sat together in the cooling air and watched the stars come out over the Texas plain, his hand warm around hers, and everything that had happened between the July meeting hall and this October evening was present in the space between them, not as weight but as substance, the accumulated warmth of a life that had been hard in the ways lives are hard and beautiful in the ways that make the hard worth it. She leaned her head against his shoulder and he leaned his head against hers, and the stars kept coming out, one by one and then all at once, as they always did, as they always would. "Clement," she said very quietly. "Birdie," he said, and that was enough. That had always been enough. That had been the thing she had been waiting to say without knowing it, and the thing he had been waiting to hear, that sound of her name in his voice and his name in her voice, worn smooth by 30 years of use, fitting perfectly into the quiet evening air of the Texas Panhandle, over the farm they had built, and the children they had raised, and the water running in the ditch, and the stars coming out overhead, solid and real and entirely, completely their own.